But please give a warm welcome to Nick Wilcox.
Okay. Just a little thing. I was wearing the do not photograph lanyard, but while I'm on stage, I consent to being photographed. Yeah, unfortunately, Stephen couldn't make it, but he's been a big part of this, so hopefully he sees this, and I do it justice. Okay, so kind of have an overview. Hearing the questions in the previous talk was pretty fun. It's sort of like Zuko is my scout. So I wanted to share a little bit about this talk about the ECC North Star, because that's how we sort of orient what we choose to do and prioritize, and it sort of defines the goals we're seeking out in the work that we're doing. Motivations, I can probably skip some of that because Zuko covered those pretty well. I'll talk about the sort of process we're taking. So this is a journey. I'm not showing up with like a proposal. I don't necessarily have a lot of answers for the questions, but definitely interested in exploring them. Then we talk about, for proof of stake, what do we think we want for Zcash. We really want to know if other people want the same things. So what do we want from a proof of stake protocol? And then I go through a bunch of high-level proof of stake protocol features that I'm aware of that touch on Zcash specific concerns that we should be thinking about, and how I see that relating to Zcash. And then future work, there's a lot of future work. And then Q&A. We'll see how far we get. Oh, I just added this slide. So I have this particular soapbox. It's a little hill I kind of want to die on, but I think it might be a losing battle. So I always try to say block producer generally when talking about any infrastructure that is participating in consensus to finalize transactions. And I don't call that a validator. And the reason is, to me, a validator is any node that should be validating the consensus rules. And I definitely don't want a proof of stake system where only block producers are validating the consensus rules. So the ideal is every shielded light wallet should be a full validator. That's where I think we should be headed with Zcash and every other blockchain. So I hope you join me in this little linguistic activism. Just say block producer. Yeah, we'll see how successful that movement is. Okay. Yeah, I kind of mentioned this, but we're early in this process. So like Zuko mentioned, in Ethereum, it's been like a 7 or something year process. I think we can be much shorter by not reinventing everything. And so the purpose of this talk and where we are at is just to give everyone an understanding of what we are thinking the big decisions in the design space are. And we're getting feedback and discussion across the whole community about those, and also to check if we're missing any, so that as we go through this process of developing like a concrete proposal for proof of stake, we're sort of doing that with the community involved the whole time, so that we're arriving at something where there's no surprises and we kind of know where consensus is at. So ECC's North Star, this is a cut and paste from a blog post. There's a lot here, but I think I just want to summarize it by saying we want really good UX for Zcash, for Zec. We want people to be able to acquire and use it permissionlessly. We want them to have many options of how to use it and who to interact with using Zcash. And we especially want to make sure that ZEC is resistant to capture, censorship, debasement, loss. And so when we're thinking of proof of stake, we want to make sure we're sort of reinforcing these goals. I kind of went through each of these and mentally made a little legend about some aspects of a proof of stake protocol that we would care about. So these are scalability, economics, and what I call resilience, to see how they relate to each of our North Star goals. I'm going to pass through that, but review that and tell us if you think it makes sense and it's consistent, like our research and push towards proof of stake is following that high-level vision for Zcash. Okay, motivations. Zuko touched on the big picture here. There's one thing I wanted to mention around resilience. So there's trade-offs between proof of work, proof of stake, and other protocols. But one thing, a development that was that informs me a lot was seeing how mining was really important and good for distributing, say, Bitcoin early on. And it was especially important to populations and vulnerable regimes with monetary problems. And what we saw in both examples is once that activity reached a certain scale, the authoritarian regimes could easily find people mining by looking at their power footprints and then just confiscate their equipment or coerce them to keep operating it and pay the regime. So for me, this is kind of an example of a failure of resilience around proof of work mining because it's tied so heavily to energy production. It sort of constrains who can do that. You need access to energy producers, and those are large-scale operations that are centralized and kind of vulnerable. Okay, so we have this notion of this process to get Zcash over to proof of stake, and right now we're just in this early phase of doing research. So I've been doing mostly like technical research, and we also do market research and user research. Hopefully we'll be doing more of that as we go, because we want to understand what does proof of stake mean for users, what does the user experience look like, what do they want or need, especially learning from their experiences with other protocols that exist today. And we're not even yet to the stage of like drafting up early proposals. That's where we want to get soon, and we want to have a really like participatory process with many stakeholders around Zcash, reviewing and refining those proposals as we head towards like step 4, where we nail it down into a Zcash improvement proposal, and then see if we get community consensus and it doesn't seem like there's a risk of like a chain split or other disaster. And then we can move on to implementing and deploying. And then there's this big can of worms that I'm not even going to get to yet, which is the question, how do we transition from existing Zcash proof of work to proof of stake? Because that's a tricky problem. So what do we want from a proof of stake protocol? I always start with UX. So what really matters at the end of the day is what can users do with Zcash, and what does it look like? How do they understand what they're doing? And what challenges or flaws are around that approach? So we have 2 big UX goals. So we want any shielded wallet user to be able to participate in earning staking returns by delegating to block producers. And we want that delegation to be easy. So for example, it would be very nice if that UX flow was just standard in every wallet and it was similar in every wallet so that no matter which wallet you're using, you have this option available to you. And then we also want low financial barrier to entry. So what that means literally is like, if you want to, ideally, you could delegate $1 worth of Zec and earn a return on it. There is some limit to the protocol's ability to support delegations, but so this is sort of setting a bar for efficiency of the delegation piece of the protocol. We really care about interoperability. So part of our North Star is making Zec accessible and usable in a wide range of situations. And a very obvious lower hanging fruit for that is just connecting to the rest of the cryptosphere. That's relatively easier than connecting out to the real economy. We really want to be doing both, but enabling interoperability soon and earlier and making sure the proof of stake protocol we're aiming for facilitates that is really important for us. There's another piece here. So there's this property called Finality, and it shows up in a couple of places, and I'll talk about it later. But if the protocol has Finality, it makes interop with many other blockchain systems a lot easier and safer. So infrastructure permissionlessness, or this is what I was calling resilience earlier. We want to make sure that new block producers can show up and participate kind of in an even playing field. So we want to avoid as much as possible the existing block producers being able to prevent new entrants. We really want that to remain permissionless so that there can be free competition and it helps protect the operation of the network from capture. Yeah, so that's sort of related to the second bullet. We want to make sure that anyone can become a new block producer and existing participants can't prevent that. A third nice to have is that block producers can operate and react in adversarial environments. So this comes back to the stories of miners in Iran and Venezuela. If it is at all feasible, it would be nice if we could protect people who are choosing to do that in those kinds of locations. We want to give them the best shot at being able to choose to do that while also protecting themselves. And then tokenomics, a big one is we want issuance to be acceptable to Zcashers. And there's a big question there of how do we know what's acceptable to Zcashers? But one easy answer is if something doesn't change, it is probably acceptable to most Zcashers. And we don't want any catastrophic dynamics. And I put Terra Luna here. And that's sort of a very obvious example for many people, especially in hindsight. But I think there are many more potential cases like that where there might be runaway feedback loops or other issues that could derail the system when there's a shock or some unexpected event, and we want to be cautious about that. So governance, Zuko mentioned that if you are delegating to stakers, there's sort of this natural way for for people to use their coins to express an opinion. And it's fairly common in some proof-of-stake protocols and a lot of DeFi to have governance tokens, where governance is sort of bound or confined to follow voting from those tokens. I think it's an interesting idea, but I think it would be terrible to either commit to that or just jump into that when we already have practical functioning governance that's been working for years and is iteratively improving. So the way I see it, I'm really interested in using the protocol, if possible, to allow people to signal decisions or opinions about things. But we should not, in my opinion, alter our official governance to be bound to that, but maybe to use that as a source of input. There's another tricky bit here around permissionlessness and decentralization. We want to make sure that it's possible to do a chain split. This sounds kind of funny, but this is a philosophy we've had from the beginning. And our first upgrade called Overwinter, the purpose of that was to make chain splits safer for people. And the reason is that's sort of the base layer of governance for blockchains. Like in the worst case, if any other layer of governance or non-governance, like in a case like maybe Bitcoin, if that goes awry and there's significant populations that just can't agree on what consensus rules should be, one of the fundamental values of blockchains, in my opinion, is that there's the ability for the chain to split, and people can, run the code that they want to run, and that can be chaotic, and the market will sort it out. But having that capability is actually like a fundamental thing that I think underpins sort of the legitimacy of blockchains and ensures that they're consensual and opt-in. So then, maturity, if we can, we prefer finding protocols that already exist in the real world and battle tested. So they're sort of proven and there's confidence that they operate correctly. We would like strong theoretical support, especially around security analysis. And we try to avoid unnecessary innovation. So this is actually similar to when we launched Zcash. We had some similar approaches or heuristics. So that's why we decided, let's just take Bitcoin, keep almost all of the design the same, and just add this shielded transfer functionality and this founder's reward. And we're not going to change the consensus mechanism or the issuance curve or anything like that. And part of the reason is, if it's shown to work elsewhere, why risk innovating in an area that isn't a key differentiating feature specifically for Zcash? And then there's table stakes. It's got to be secure, permissionless. We would like good scaling properties. So if there's something missing from this list, or you're concerned or have questions about any of these bullets, definitely post in the Zcash R&D or the Discord. Okay, so the rest of the talk, the bulk of the talk is introducing different aspects of proof of stake protocol design that are sort of high level and big picture, and thinking about what that would mean for Zcash. So the first one that pops up here is that there's this fundamental trade-off in consensus protocols for both proof of work and proof of stake between something called finality and availability, or sometimes dynamic availability. And so it's a trade-off. You have to pick one or the other. You might try to munge the two together. And for example, Ethereum 2 is doing that. But we should really think about the underlying trade-off here and what we should aim for. So in finality, the guarantee that you get is that if you submit a transaction and it becomes finalized by the protocol, then that transaction will never be reverted. So that's really nice because you don't have to worry about thinking about a block confirmation depth. You don't have to worry about if somebody pays you and then you give them the boat or the car or whatever, and then the transaction is reverted. How do you get back the boat or the car or the coffee? So we believe that's good for commerce, and it provides consistency and an expectation that all users can sort of understand and rally around, and that's generally good economically. The downside is that protocols with finality can halt, because ultimately the way to ensure that transactions can't become unfinalized is to ensure a sufficient number of the block producers are signing off on the fact that the transaction is final. And if that sort of quorum of block producers isn't online or available or responding, the network has no choice but to halt to avoid inconsistently finalizing, say, double spending transactions. So that's a pretty big downside. Dynamic availability, on the other hand, of which proof of work is an example, has different trade-offs. So it doesn't halt, it never halts. If you submit a transaction, it can get into a block, and other blocks can begin being stacked on top of that. And so you can see some progress happening. And then the trade-off is blocks can be reverted. And you kind of have you can guess probabilistically about how likely that is, but it's always a possibility. And a lot of the probabilistic reasoning has a bunch of assumptions about, say, mining capacity and how much time has elapsed and things of that nature. And if any of those assumptions aren't actually true for some reason, so this would be a pretty terrible security break, those rollbacks might be a lot larger than someone might have expected. So how do I think about this for Zcash? First of all, it seems pretty much orthogonal or separate from sort of the core Zcash functionality of shielded asset storage and transfer. So it seems like we could choose either option, and we could still plug in, say, the Orchard protocol, and wallets would operate mostly the same. So let's see. I'm going to do a brief aside from the text, because I want to compare the two downsides of the two cases. So the worst downside in dynamically available like proof of work is you might have a long rollback, and it might be surprisingly long because of some other flaw. Like, let's say there's a proof of work breakthrough, and an attacker can use that to roll back, let's say, Bitcoin. And they can roll back Bitcoin for 6 hours, right? So the question is, what would the community do? What would a decentralized permissionless community do in response to that? Well, the answer isn't clear, but let's say if it's 6 hours, people might agree, and let's assume the other issue is discovered and fixed. So people might agree to just accept that rollback and just go with the new thing now that the other issue is fixed. And maybe most people would find that acceptable. But what happens if that rollback is, instead of 6 hours, let's say it's a week? Now what happens? Well, is all of the community going to accept the rollback, or will people disagree? And if people disagree, what happens? I think one possibility is that there's a chain split, and one is like, we accept this rollback, and the other says we don't. And if you keep carrying that thinking forward, if the rollback is the last year of transactions, then maybe most people would be like, actually, we don't accept that rollback. Let's figure out something else. Let's checkpoint one that we all saw, that we all liked and thought was real. So thinking about that failure mode emphasizes that there's this coordination problem. Now, if we think about the failure mode of final protocols, the network halts, there's a different kind of failure mode, and that is you need to restart the network. Well, in a proof of work network or dynamically available network, it has a really good story for this. Like, if somehow all of the miners just halted one day, like let's say they crashed because they all had the same bug, the very first miner that figures out how to fix that and restart has a huge advantage because they will have all of the hash rate and their revenue would be massive. So all of the miners independently are motivated to get up and running as quickly as possible. And as soon as there's one miner, because of dynamic availability, the network can begin processing transactions. With a finalizing protocol, when it halts, it's because there's not a quorum of block producers available and online. And so how do you restart from that? You need to get a quorum available and online, and they have to coordinate on restarting. So this is, in my view, a really big concern because since they need to coordinate, there's a risk that it's not permissionless. Like who coordinates? It could be the set of block producers that were in the last known state. Well, what if some of them are malicious or refuse to coordinate? And furthermore, what if there are other people who could be block producers who want to do the restart and who are more competent and more available and more ready? It would be really nice if we could find a way to enable permissionless restarts. So even with those trade-offs, I still tend to prefer finality because I think that during the non-failure mode, like the standard runtime behavior, the benefits are better for users, and hopefully most of the time the chain exists is the non-failure mode, and so we want to sort of maximize the benefit to users most of the time. But I still am really interested in addressing this permissionless restart issue. The last bullet here talks about something called ebb and flow protocols, and I'm pretty sure ETH2 might be considered one of these. And so these are protocols that basically try to do both. So they have a dynamically available subprotocol that produces blocks, and then they have another subprotocol that finalizes blocks sort of after they've been produced. And now that might be good for restarting because the dynamically available protocol can restart without coordinating. But it has this other sort of strange failure mode where if the finalizing protocol is failing to coordinate to restart, but the dynamically available protocol is continuing ahead, what do users do? You have the same sort of coordination issue that's similar to the really big Bitcoin rollbacks, where some users might say, well, let's just stick with the dynamically available protocol and don't worry about finality henceforth. And other users might say, no, we really need finality and we refuse to honor your deposit until it's final. And so the economy will become like less coherent. So those are promising. And I'm curious if we can maybe adapt them in a way that is specifically only for restarting the network somehow, and somehow avoid that potential for different users to be confused about whether or not to accept transactions. We actually saw this in Ethereum 2, where their dynamically available subprotocol, I forgot the name, but it had a rollback recently, and that should not happen, but it did happen. And there's a lot of discussion about it, but as far as I understand, none of the guarantees of either subprotocol were violated. So finality was not violated. But people still considered it a problem because they assume many users will rely on transactions that aren't final. And so to me, this seems potentially really costly because different users, like if I'm going to send a transaction to you, we both need to agree on when to decide if the transfer went through or did not go through. And if different people have different beliefs or assumptions, that's really going to impede the ability to transact well. Oh man, I should probably try to get through these faster. Okay, so the next feature, issuance. This is a huge one. when we first mentioned that we had these motivations for switching to proof of stake, a fair amount of like the rando Twitter comment tweeters who tend to only tweet a smaller, like limited set of narratives, brought up one common narrative that I think is just wrong, where they just assumed proof of stake means no constraints on issuance, or like loose constraints on issuance, or discretionary issuance, or something like that. So basically in their mind, or in that narrative, proof of stake means not having a clear non-discretionary issuance policy. And I don't think that's true, so I think it's really important for the community to talk a lot about issuance. But there's definitely challenges around it. So if you have higher issuance, that means whoever is delegating or staking is earning higher nominal returns. So they get more tokens in response to however many tokens they've posted. So it might make it more attractive in a sense, but there's some limit to that, right? If issuance is like the whole supply is expanded by a factor of 10 every year, then if you stake, it seems awesome because like you stake 1 Zec and like next year you'll have 11 or whatever. But it doesn't actually work out economically because the supply has ballooned. So we should expect the exchange rate to have gone way down. And this is something that I feel like confuses a lot of people, especially around a lot of like scam tokens. And also a higher issuance rate is worse for users who aren't staking. And I think it's really important that we don't like overvalue stakers. So I think staking will be really important and could be valuable for many users. But just holding Zec and transacting Zec are like are critical and sort of like the fundamental value. So we don't want to make that too costly. If we go the other way and lower issuance, we have some problems in the opposite way. So if issuance is a lot lower, then there's less of a disadvantage to being a normal user who's just holding or spending. And the nominal returns are lower, but the rate at which the supply increases is also lower. So just for like the same level of demand, we might expect that a lower issuance rate would lead to the exchange price sort of dwindling much slower than a high issuance rate where the exchange price might dwindle fast for a given unit. Okay, so we gotta find that balance. And Zuko mentioned this proposal that we posted called the Posterity Fund. And the purpose of the Posterity Fund is just to provide a framework that could keep the same 21 million supply cap and roughly the same issuance schedule. And one reason it might be a useful framework to adopt around proof of stake is that it would provide clarity about and constraints on how we can change issuance in a proof of stake transition. So if we're going to do a proof of stake transition and there is something like the Posterity Fund, we would probably say there's a constraint that the transition to proof of stake can't alter the Posterity Fund framework because that's kind of the purpose of that framework. And so that could provide clarity and certainty to users of Zec. The last part here is that there are other sort of like macroeconomic concerns around issuance that I'm having difficulty wrapping my head around because like I don't have an economics background or a finance background, but I think they're still really important. And these ones are like kind of general, not even to proof of stake, but kind of to all of cryptocurrency. And so one question is, let's say you have a blockchain and it has a proof of stake system, and if you post your funds into the proof of stake system, you earn 10% returns per year nominally. But there's this really awesome DeFi app that gives you 30% or 20% yield. Just deposit it over here. And so I call this the Luna attack because that's what Terra and Luna were promising. And the frustrating thing is that was just not sustainable, but it kind of didn't matter, and it kind of had the potential to worsen the security of proof-of-stake networks because people who might otherwise decide to post stake would instead put it into this house of cards. And that's kind of an extreme example, but let's say there's like another yield-generating thing that isn't necessarily house of cards. Maybe it is much lower risk. It has meaningful value. There's a reason it exists, and it should exist. And it just happens to pay a higher rate than the native staking return rate. That can be dangerous for the security of the proof-of-stake protocol. And there's actually a paper about this from Gauntlet Research where they did like stochastic modeling and imagine there's a chain with staking and it has one DeFi app. What happens when the rates of return grow or decrease between the two? And basically, it wasn't good when the DeFi returns outpaced the staking returns. That's kind of a more specific issue of a more general problem is what if you can earn better returns overall anywhere in the economy? Why would you choose to stake? And so I think there's the economic analysis we should continue to sort through. And I think we should also pay a lot of attention to people's other motivations for staking besides just pure finance. But it's still something on my radar. And by the way, I think proof of work basically has many of the similar concerns, but maybe it's less obvious. Maybe the time scales are longer, so maybe people haven't noticed it as much yet. I've talked a bit already about how this might apply to Zcash. One piece was if we have the posterity fund or something else like it, we could have an agreement that we're going to constrain the issuance to kind of follow the original Bitcoin curve, roughly. If we do that, there's going to be some challenges based on what I was just saying from the previous slide, because what if that constraint requires issuance to be lower than like a economic analysis would suggest would be safe? So I don't have an answer as to whether or not that's the case or not yet. So that's future work to dig into for sure. Oh, this is a tangent about the Zcash Posterity Fund. Here's an image. There's basically two features to it. One is it maintains the 21 million ZEC supply cap. And on the right, this would be a world with the Posterity Fund. The only notable different thing is that up arrow called deposits. So it would open the door for like other kinds of fees in the protocol to basically pay out to future block rewards instead of just immediately directly to a miner. But again, this is a tangent. It's not specific or required for proof of stake, but I still think it might be a useful sort of framework to help us approach transitioning to proof of stake by simplifying some pieces as we go so that we're not like reinventing the whole world all at once. Okay, privacy, super important for Zcash. It is just the case that staking amounts have to be public for a variety of reasons, as far as I know. So one is you want to know like how much is staked behind each block producer to have some idea of like the distribution between block producers to understand their control over consensus, similar to how you want to know the relative hash rates of different mining pools. And some proof-of-stake protocols can have something called slashing, where you're going to penalize block producers for misbehaving. And if you're doing that, you need to see, the protocol needs to be able to take those funds in a slashing event, which is like a fine. But more so, I think it's really important that the general public knows that that happens and knows when and which block producer and for how much, because they need to be deciding how much to rely on that block producer. There's something called delegation, which I've been sort of alluding to, but yeah, if you're going to delegate your ZEC to another block producer to earn a return while they do like most of the work, you're sort of just supporting them financially. It's a little bit like contributing your miner to a miner pool. You want to know if that block producer is getting slashed, because you might not want to continue to support them because they're either incompetent or malicious. So those, I think, should be public, but a lot, many other things could be private around staking. So some examples might be like network privacy around block producers, and also the sources and history of staking positions or staking bonds. So for Zcash, I feel like there's a relatively simple way to merge shielded functionality to staking. I say relatively simple, but there's some challenge to it. But basically the idea is staking bonds are public amounts, but there's no, and they're associated with a block producer, but there's no history associated with them, and when they are withdrawn, they must disappear back into the shielded pool. So you can sort of think of it as maybe it's sort of akin to a T address, except it's a T address that has no address associated, and you can't do anything but reshield it. I think that's relatively straightforward and has pretty decent privacy. So that is just sort of a straw man proposal. I'd love to get more feedback on it. Okay, delegation. I've been talking about this a bit, but the idea is you could have a protocol that says, hey, if you want to be a block producer, you have to participate in consensus directly and produce blocks, and that's the only way to earn any return on stake. So you have to have some stake, you have to run this node, you have to perform this service, you get the return. The issue with that is that I think a lot of people want returns, but they don't want to do the work. And I think that is reasonable, because I think being a block producer is like a specialized skill, and it will require like dedication and time. And if the protocol doesn't support it, it will still happen, and it'll happen in a bad way. So third parties, like exchanges, this is a very natural thing for an exchange to do, can say, hey, we'll run a bunch of block producers, just deposit your funds with us, we'll take care of it for you, and we'll give you most of the returns. And people want that. There's a demand for that. So if the protocol doesn't support delegation, in my opinion, it's worse for decentralization. And I think we should when there's demand for something, we should enable that in a way that can protect the users as best as possible in the protocol if it's feasible. So our preference would be, we do want to build in delegation. And that has a lot of like second order effects. For example, if the protocol doesn't have delegation, but the exchange offers a service, that exchange controls the whole like usability pipeline. So you go to their website, you use their they have a menu on their thing. After you've logged in, you do what they want you to do, and they give you a return, and they control the block producers. If it's built into the protocol, it's much more likely we can have all wallets provide a standard UX. And this is good for both users because now they have the same experience choosing different block producers. So if they have more choice to choose between block producers, that's definitely something we want to enable. And it's also good for block producers because block producers don't have to figure out, how do I add this UX to get users to delegate funds to me? And then another obvious piece that I missed about how it's safer for users is that the protocol can prevent the block producers from controlling the user's funds except in very limited ways. So the block producers can't take the user's funds, spend the user's funds, et cetera. They can only use those funds to sort of contribute to their weight in the protocol. So that seems like definitely something we should aim for. Kind of already covered that. And I also bring in privacy again here, so which I've covered. OK, slashing. You could have a protocol that doesn't have slashing. An example would be Bitcoin proof of work. Or you can have a protocol that has slashing. And slashing is if the protocol can detect bad behavior, which could be malicious or incompetent. It can destroy or fine funds that have been posted by that actor. So I have a preference to have slashing. And the reason is we want to disincentivize bad behavior. But this does have important implications. So for example, if a block producer is slashed, this probably applies the slashing fine to anyone who delegated to them. So what that means is delegating Zec in this kind of proof of stake protocol to a block producer is taking on a risk. You're joining that block producer in a risky endeavor to earn a return. And so you want to be able to rely on them. So you want to find a block producer that's competent and trustworthy. And that's important for users to understand if we have this kind of system. The reason that penalizing block producers directly for bad behavior is really helpful is it's specific to the bad actor. So in systems without slashing like Bitcoin, if you have a bad actor miner, the worst that happens is they miss out on some block rewards. And so to compensate, to make missing out on those block rewards feel bad and be a disincentive, the block rewards need to be large. If the block rewards become small, that disincentive goes away. Like, it's not so bad if you miss out for a little while. So having slashing, I think, is a way to incentivize block producers in a way that could require lower rewards, which means lower issuance, which means you get the service of safely finalizing blocks. As a user, you get that service for less cost. For Zcash, one thing is this is orthogonal again to any of the shielded functionality. A lot of these are, but they still matter for our decisions around Zcash. So basically the only stuff that touches on the shielded functionality is privacy around staking as far as I can tell. So what that means is as a community, we can choose between a lot of these design options. Okay, derivatives, or often called liquid staking. So derivatives, if you post Zec into the staking system to earn returns, it's a locked up. The reason it's a locked up, there's multiple reasons, but one reason might be to make it available for slashing. If you do that, you can't use it. That is a cost. Somebody asked Zuko how to quantify that cost. I don't know necessarily how to quantify that cost, but there's an equivalent cost in proof of work where you have to post your tokens into buying hardware or energy. So derivatives are this idea where like, hey, why don't you delegate your tokens to me? I'm a handy-dandy, trustworthy block producer, and I promise not to get slashed. And if you give me X tokens, I'll give you X Nate bucks. And hopefully you can do stuff with Nate bucks, like trade them on an exchange or something like that. So derivatives are hard to reason about for me, but there's definitely, unquestionably, strong demand for them. And one prominent example would be in Ethereum. In Ethereum 2, there's no built-in protocol support for any kind of derivative, and so third parties began offering different types of derivatives. And it's really easy to imagine, like you don't need to do anything technical. You can just have an exchange, say, delegate your Zec to my block producer, and I will issue you exchange bucks. It doesn't even have to be on a blockchain. All that matters is there's some value to it. You can do something with it. It's worth more than zero. People really want that. So I think here, again, this is another case where I think we should support it in the protocol for similar reasons as delegation. If we support it in the protocol, it levels the playing field for block producers so they don't have to figure out how to add issuance mechanisms, and they don't have to figure out the UX for all of that stuff, right? So if it's supported in the protocol, again, wallets could provide a standard UX. And now the question is, but are they good or bad for the protocol? It's kind of hard. I don't know yet. So there are some good aspects. So like if you can post 10 Zec to stake and there's no derivatives, it's locked up. If you can post 10 Zec and get 10 Nate Zec, and there's some exchange rate, or you can do something with Nate Zec, you can do that and gain value from it. And you haven't lost your 10 Zec as long as there's no slashing. And you're earning rewards. So it's like even better, right? You get these two benefits. So because there's these two benefits, maybe it's more likely people will want to post their funds for stake. So it encourages more coins to be posted to stake, which makes the security of the network stronger. So those seem good. It's also, there's the argument that people want it. So if they want it, it's good in a way. But it's tricky for me to think about incentives. So there's all kinds of like second order economic issues. So if you can get a staking derivative, Nate Zec, if you delegate to me 10 Zec, I give you 10 Nate Zec, you go to an exchange and you sell 10 Nate Zec for Zec, and then you come back and you delegate that Zec to me, and I give you some more Nate Zec. You can keep doing that. And that's leverage, and that's leveraging up into staking. So leverage scares me because, as we've seen recently with the giant wave of deleveraging events across cryptocurrency, it can have like sudden, unpredictable effects. There is one thing about this kind of leverage that is better than like a Terra Luna fiasco. I keep bringing it up, but it's such a dramatic example. I mean, seriously. So with staking derivatives, the base Zec is still this base kind of cryptocurrency that's sort of like this bearer token or something of this value. And the leveraging up you're doing isn't leveraging up a kind of liability, as it has been in a lot of DeFi stuff. So it's when you're leveraging up liabilities that things can get even worse, I think. But this is still something to keep an eye on. Getting low on time. Let me see. Derivatives, for Zcash, I think we should aim for them, but I'm not sure with derivatives if it depends on sort of the timing and stuff. It might make sense to have a simpler protocol that we activate first, and then later we begin adding features. Maybe derivatives would be one. A really important thing about derivatives is they require multiple assets. So if we have something like ZSAs, that could be a building block. So now we need to figure out, okay, what are these two roadmaps and what are their relative timing to be able to begin to answer questions like this. Okay, so that was like a tour of high-level proof-of-stake features that I think are really relevant for us to figure out. I could be missing some high-level areas, so hit me up on the Discord or elsewhere. So future work, there's so much future work. So I didn't even talk at all about transitioning. How do we get from Zcash proof of work to proof of stake? That's like a whole talk or several on itself. And we also still don't have any like specific clear proposal. There's lots of different ideas. Interoperability, I didn't dig into that. I actually expected we were going to have a talk more specifically about that, but since Stephen couldn't make it, that's not here. And then there's a bunch of stuff I say Nate needs to understand. I feel like other people around the industry, maybe in this room, already have a better handle on some of this stuff. So I actually don't know much about dynamically available proof-of-stake systems. I've sort of just focused on my biases around like finality so far. The permissionless network restart issue is still like a big open issue for me, and I want to learn from anyone who knows about that. And then I still don't have a solid grasp on how issuance rates interact with security, or what are some of the second order things we should be worried about with staking derivatives. So if you want to help me with any of this, please do. I need a lot of help. Okay. So that's the tour.
Right. Questions from Discord. We are nearly out of time, so let's try and go quick with these. What is your greatest fear about the prospect of Zcash transitioning from proof of work to proof of stake?
Greatest fear? Oh, this is a good question. It's like I don't know, I feel like it's a game show question. Yeah, greatest fear, I'm an anxious person, so I have all kinds of fears all the time about all kinds of things, but so I think one fear would be like the transition plan or process. It takes a long time or is not sufficiently motivated so that we add this complexity with this goal of getting over to this proof of stake island. But what we see in practice with the marketplace is like some users are into that and others aren't. And now what do we do? Like, are we going to complete the transition? Is there going to be a fork? Do we just maintain this more complex thing forever without achieving some of the benefits? And I think, like with Ethereum 2 right now, there's talk of like this proof of work fork. I don't know how big of a deal that will be, but I'm hoping we can avoid that kind of confusion.
T-Bar question, are you familiar with Penumbra's proof of stake design?
Slightly. I'm slightly familiar with Penumbra's proof of stake design. And when I say slightly, I just understand it as having some privacy properties. I don't remember the specific ones, but I think it might be something along the lines of, you know, if you're delegating to a block producer, you have strong on-chain privacy. That's about all I can recall at the moment.
The next part of the question was, are there any features from that design that you want to, or not want to adopt for Zcash itself, but you're not too familiar with it?
it's been a while since I've read over Penumbra docs, like maybe 6 months or a year, but everything I read I thought was really awesome. And so I kind of want to crib from them where we can, if it seems like a good idea. I do think there might be some things they've done where I would prefer a simpler thing, like using a more standard thing, because maybe the requirements I would want for privacy would be less stringent, or yeah.
Okay. Final question. What happens to the Zcash ecosystem when it loses miners? Has a cost-benefit analysis been done to guarantee net benefits?
That's a really awesome question. We haven't done that kind of analysis, but that is the kind of analysis we want to do. Early on, when I mentioned the process, I mentioned research, and there was a few categories, but 2 were market research and user research. We definitely want to do that kind of analysis. Back when we transitioned, when the network transitioned sort of naturally from non-ASIC to ASIC mining, that came from the marketplace, not from us, and it sort of happened when it happened. And we ended up not reacting in any way to that. So it basically played out in the marketplace. And later, we saw different analyses that showed there were many participants in Zcash who were GPU mining, and many of them probably just went away. So we lost a lot of users. So it's a very humbling experience, and we want to do the kind of market research to know if that's coming and avoid it at all costs. So, yeah.
And that's all we have time for.
Yeah, thanks.
Let's give it up for Nate. Thank you very much.